But let's speak to Yaakov Katz, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Where do you think the region stands right now?
Well, I think we're in the potential beginning of another stage, and what some might call even an escalation in this conflict that's been going on now for almost a year, since October 8th, when Hezbollah began assaulting Israel with rockets and drones and other explosive devices, anti-tank missiles. Israel has been striking back over the last couple of weeks, and now is a possible ground offensive that I think would be isolated if it does take place. I'm also hearing that it could happen imminently in the next 24 hours or so. And it would be aimed at basically removing the Hezbollah infrastructure that is still along the border with Israel in the north. And because of that infrastructure and those terrorists and those weapons that are there, has been what forced is about 60 to 70,000 Israelis to have to flee and evacuate their communities along the border.
So just tell us a little bit about that border area, as you have mentioned. What do we mean by Hezbollah infrastructure? Just describe the area, I suppose, well, both sides of the border, but on the Lebanon side. This isn't a populated area, for example, on that side.
Well, some of it is populated, right? They do have villages that are scattered throughout southern Lebanon. It's an area that I would say goes about 10 to 15 kilometers north from Israel, just a little further north into Lebanon. In that area, you have a couple hundred villages that run from the east to the west, basically to the Mediterranean coast. And Hezbollah has significant pockets and infrastructure, rockets that it has deposited in those areas, tunnels that Israel has discovered some in the past, and there are likely more that have yet to be uncovered. There are command centers, there are weapons caches that are there. And as a result, Israel feels that in order to provide the security that it needs for its people to be able to go back to their homes, all of that infrastructure and that weaponry and those terrorists who are there and hunkering down have to be eliminated and have to be removed. Otherwise, how can anyone live safely along that border? And that's basically what we've been experiencing, right? Just to give you an example, Lewis, there's one Israeli town called Metula, which is just, it kind of butts up along the border, kind of on the, I would say, the north, middle central area of the border between Israel and Lebanon. And they've had over 100 homes literally destroyed by Hezbollah rockets and anti-tank weapons in the last year. For people to be able to live safely, we can't have a Hezbollah terrorist entity that is sitting on that border with weapons that can threaten those people.
What are some of the risks? What are some of the calculations here that will have been made? And just to underscore, we don't have any confirmation of any incursion, of any movement at all at this stage. But what are some of the risks if it happens?
Well, let me explain firstly, maybe just what are the reasons that you would want to go in from on the ground, because until now we've seen a lot of aerial assaults and bombardments by Israel and attacks from the air. But what is the purpose of a ground offensive? And I would say there's probably three reasons. The first is you have to put boots on the ground to uncover infrastructure and targets that you just might not know about and you can't easily access from the air. And being on the ground enables you to discover a tunnel shaft or some other target that you didn't know was there. The second reason is you have to really clear out that area in a real intensive way. And to do that, you need to put boots on the ground. And the third reason is, I would also say symbolically, it's important to show the enemy, in this case Hezbollah and Iran, that Israel is not afraid to go in and to cross that border and to engage the enemy face to face. But the risks are exactly that, is when you're inside another country, in another territory, an enemy territory, you can get bogged down. You can get caught inside that so-called Lebanese mud. You can lose casualties. When you're fighting from the air, it's much more sterile. But to have your own troops there means casualties of your own in that close quarter combat. And then you start to lose popularity of that offensive potentially among your own people domestically. So there's a lot of different calculations here. And I think that's the reason that if this does happen, and again, we don't know for sure that it is going to happen, it's going to have to be something that's not going to be necessarily very fast. It's going to have to move very carefully. Israel is going to have to use a lot of firepower. And it's going to try to be very targeted, very precise and accurate in just going against the Hezbollah targets that are in that area.
Given those calculations, one of the calculations that will be made, of course, is the relationship with allies like the US. the US still supports a ceasefire, which seems completely at odds with any incursion, if, as we've both been underlining, if it takes place. We have no confirmation that it has. How much of a problem is that?
Well, I mean, there's no question, Lewis, that the Israel-US alliance is of existential importance for this country, for the Jewish state of Israel, and it does require that America stands at its side, whether it's in basic, just material support, weapons, equipment, or its diplomatic support at places like the UN Security Council and around the world, where likely Israel will face many condemnations from countries all over that will say that this is a flagrant violation of international law and an escalation that they do not want to see. So Israel will be relying on the US for this and for that cover. But I would say that also Israel, at the end of the day, has to do what is in its best interest. And it is in Israel's interest right now, with Hezbollah weakened, after the pager attack, after the elimination of Hezbollah's top leadership, including the Friday night strike that took out their mythical, legendary leader, Hassan Nasrallah, almost, I would say, the equivalent of Osama bin Laden, essentially, here in the Middle East, finally eliminated. There is a real unique opportunity for Israel, and I would even argue for the United States and Europe, to finally tackle this threat of Hezbollah and to change the equation on the Iranians, to liberate Lebanon from the grasp and the clutches of this Iranian proxy, and to give the Lebanese an opportunity to finally reestablish their country as the prosperous, economic, and free country that it once was, until it was taken under the stranglehold of this Iranian terrorist organization.
A reporter was just asking, in the US State Department briefing that we quoted a little bit from earlier on, a reporter was asking if Benjamin Netanyahu is actually expanding the war in both Lebanon and Yemen. What do you make of that?
To me, I see it as really an important message that is being sent to Israel's adversaries and to its enemies. What we've seen over the last year, Lewis, is that Israel is fighting on multiple fronts and is really surrounded by enemies. We could argue, and there could be even legitimate criticism of the way Israel might be prosecuting some of those wars, but in some of those conflicts, whether it's in Gaza or in other places. But there's no questioning the fact that Israel today is probably the most threatened and attacked country in the world. While Ukraine is under attack, and even fiercely, from Russia, it's one enemy that Ukraine faces. Israel's facing enemies in Yemen. Israel's facing enemies in Lebanon. Israel's facing enemies in Iran itself, which has directly attacked. Cruise missiles that come from Iraq. And of course, terrorist elements and cells inside the West Bank, closer to Israeli towns. So we have multiple threats on multiple fronts. And therefore, to launch these attacks against Yemen and against those Houthi targets there, another Iranian proxy, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course to continue the offensive in Gaza, where we still have 101 hostages who are being held in some dark Hamas terror dungeon, all is really important to be able to finally defeat and eliminate and degrade the capabilities of these enemies, but also to send a message that the way things once were is no longer going to be tolerated. Israel is kind of changing the rules. There's no longer a policy of containment. Let's hope that everything will be okay. Hope doesn't keep your people safe. Sadly, as we've seen over the last year, after what we saw on October 7th of last year, that containment doesn't work and Hamas came invading and flooding into our country. We saw that on October 8th when Hezbollah began to attack Israel. This is unfortunately the reality that has been forced and coerced upon this country.
Yaakov Katz, thank you very much for coming on the programme and talking us through that. Thank you.